Welcome to Clean Tightness. Today we're exploring the critical intersection of science, policy, and global collaboration in driving the clean energy revolution. We have with us Professor Saleem H, a renowned expert in science diplomacy, environmental education, and corporate community partnership. Professor Saleem H, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much.
We're honored to have you. Your work spans multiple disciplines, all focused on creating a more sustainable future. To begin, could you provide an overview of your work and your primary area of focus?
Yes, so my research is as an environmental systems scientist focused on how we can reconcile various kinds of conflicts over natural resources through scientific and social mechanisms. So I look at complex conflicts that you might have over natural resources, like, for example, a large mining project. And so, what would be some of the ways in which we can use science and the process of environmental impact assessment to resolve those conflicts between the corporation and the community? So that's kind of where I operate. I operate at the nexus between natural science and social science.
You're a leading practitioner of science diplomacy. How can science diplomacy facilitate the global adoption of clean energy technologies and policies?
So the term science diplomacy has had a lot of different meanings. It can be configured around how you might use science to understand diplomatic processes. But for me, science diplomacy is the use of instrumental use of science to resolve conflicts. And for that, I would say the way forward is to make sure that you have the same knowledge and interpretation of knowledge across nations around different issues. And then you find a way where you can have some points of convergence. Now, you will always have disagreements over some aspects of science, but you always try to find what would be those common elements that would lead to consensus. So, an example, one of the best examples of science diplomacy is the Antarctic Treaty. During the height of the Cold War, you had all these countries which had multiple claims over the territory of Antarctica. They came together, and this was because it was the International Geophysical Year. In the 1950s, there was a lot of movement around trying to use geology and geoscience for international cooperation. And these countries disagreed over even what they claimed over Antarctica, but they did agree over the fact that this was so important a natural resource area, and it was so special as there was no human habitation that we needed to have a treaty to protect Antarctica. And that treaty has survived to this day. So Antarctica is a great example of science diplomacy in practice.
And with more warming, that treaty will become more and more relevant.
Yes, exactly. And you have, scientific bases there across Antarctica. And these scientists are now, as the ice is melting, they are discovering new areas of research. For example, ancient viruses that had been frozen are being now potentially exposed. And because we have this science cooperation, you can have even, Russians and Americans cooperating over research potentially, even though they don't get along in other areas.
What are the key challenges in bridging the gap between scientific research and political decision making in the context of clean energy?
So, with reference to clean energy, I think what's particularly challenging is the role of technology and intellectual property over these kinds of new frontier developments that we're seeing, whether it's with solar power or wind or with geothermal energy. And you have a lot of private sector investment in that. So, ideally, you would want to be able to share these technologies much more freely. But there are some impediments to that. And that's where I think the role of science diplomacy can be also more effective. China, for example, has been a leader in green technology development, particularly renewable energy development in various ways. And so, what can happen with the ways in which that technology is shared with developing countries as well as others in an affordable way? That would be an example of science diplomacy taking part in the context of green technologies and clean technologies. Similarly, you also have sharing of data for different kinds of pollution concerns. which can be important. So, for example, between India and Pakistan, which is an area of special interest for me in terms of environmental diplomacy, both countries do not have good relations with each other, but there can be a great opportunity for them to share data on air quality concerns and technologies which can reduce air quality concerns and improve air quality, I should say better so, and then use that as a means of helping two of the biggest cities in South Asia, which are both often labeled as the most polluted cities, Delhi in India and Lahore in Pakistan. So there are different ways in which we can really operationalize this.
In your experience, what are the most effective strategies for international cooperation in clean energy initiatives?
With some of the clean energy initiatives that are currently focusing on public transport, I think have a lot of potential in high density areas, and especially in the developing world, because we know that air quality to a large degree now in urban context is being impacted by transport pollution. And so the shift towards mass transit in high density in urban areas, that has much potential, but we have to make sure that that transport infrastructure is sustainably sourced and the energy comes from clean sources as well for that.
How can nations with varying levels of development and resources work together to achieve common clean energy goals?
Well, ultimately, we have an international legal mechanism, and we could have much better adherence to international treaties around environmental cooperation. And that could lead to a much better outcome down the road for all these countries. The problem is that the international legal system is very slow and it's consensus driven. So, many times you don't have the level of stringency that you might want. So, as we've seen with the climate change treaty, that has been very difficult to implement and for all these countries to be able to meet those targets. So, my own feeling is many times what we need is also cooperation at the level of cities, local governments. And we have organizations like ICLE, the International Council on Local Environmental Initiatives, which is promising organization that I think we should be supporting, and that gets cities, mayors of cities, and local governments to cooperate over best performance metrics, share best practices. Some of this needs to be done also at the level of local government.
How do you see the role of international organizations like the UN in promoting and coordinating global clean energy efforts?
The continues to play a very important role in especially resourcing developing countries with these kinds of efforts. So, for example, the Global Environment Facility, which was a trust fund that was set up in 1992 after the Earth Summit, it's the largest multilateral trust fund for environmental treaties. It's aimed to focus on developing countries and help to support them in meeting their obligations. So the UN can be a very important conduit for these kinds of efforts, whereby you have resource transfer from rich countries to poorer countries to be able to do these kinds of programs. Also, the UN has a certain ability to bring together governments which may not otherwise get along with each other. So I think that has a lot of potential in terms of fostering environmental cooperation. And we know that, for example, the only treaty in the UN system which has been ratified by all UN member states is the Ozone Treaty, which was signed in the 1980s to reduce the depletion of the ozone layer from chlorofluorocarbons and other chemicals. So we have this example that actually environmental issues can bring all these countries, even North Korea and the United States and Iran and others who may not get along with each other, but the UN can be a platform by which they can come together. And that's why in New York, you have, even though the US has no diplomatic relations with Iran or North Korea, you still have ambassadors in New York City with the headquarters. So the UN has this very important multilateral role, which we should cherish and make sure is protected.
What are some successful examples of international collaborations that have accelerated clean energy adoption?
Well, if you go back to the Copenhagen COP, which was held in 2008, I believe it was a long time ago. At that time, you had the establishment of the Green Climate Fund, and you also had the establishment of the Green Growth Institute, the Global Green. Both of those have been important initiatives for clean energy delivery. The Green Growth Institute, which is based in South Korea, that has been focused on financing clean technologies as a means of also supporting economic development and employment. So you want to make sure that the kinds of technologies you're developing, they also create jobs. And so those are examples where there has been success from the multilateral system like the UN in supporting these efforts.
You have experience with the United Nations University. How does this experience inform your ideas on the global clean energy transition?
Yes, so the United Nations University is essentially a think tank for the UN, which was established through a generous gift from the Japanese government, $1 billion endowment, which they gave many decades ago, and its headquarters are in Tokyo. And it is to UN member states and educate them around issues, largely around sustainability issues. And the it has some degrees and certificates, so there is also an educational aspect to it. But the real virtue of the United Nations University is that it gives that UN imprimatur for credentials and supports them for developing countries, particularly. And so it's very much focused on making sure that you have the best available synthesis for policymakers that is there for UN member states, but then also to empower developing countries in terms of some of their core areas of interest. So the university operates through a network of institutes which are all over the world. And so you have an water, environment, and health in Canada, which is the one I'm affiliated with. And so, that's their focal area, have programming around that. You have also, an institute on biotechnology in Venezuela. And even though right now Venezuela is in so much turmoil, but because of the UN imprimatur, that institute has still survived. And I had a chance to visit it last year and was amazed to see that, there are still people doing research because it was established through a mechanism when the Venezuelan economy was doing well. They had set up a small endowment for that institute. Because it was a United Nations entity, those resources have been protected so far.
How can we avoid resource wars that may arise from the raw materials necessary for the clean energy transition?
I think the way to prevent resource wars is to recognize that ultimately we need to find the most economically and ecologically efficient way to develop clean energies. So, if we bring in both the economy and the ecology together, you would not have as much of the resource wars. You do need to have some agreements on access and trade of resources so that you don't have a situation where one country can constrain those resources. Because if you do that, then you will either have resource wars or you would have this situation where you will develop extractive industries in places where they're not well suited, where you don't have the right ecology or you don't have the right energy infrastructure, and it's also not economically viable. So, this is a special concern right now because of the conflict between China and the West, because China already has the infrastructure for extractive industries. So, if you're going to open new mines and new smelters, you're going to actually damage the environment more. But because there's this fear that China might constrain supply, the West is trying to develop a lot of their own infrastructure. So I think we need to figure out a mechanism to make sure we never have that kind of resource supply constraint. And one of the ideas I have presented, and I did this in a TED talk last year with the Rockefeller Foundation, was the idea of a minerals trust, that we have both countries which are producing minerals and those which are demanding minerals come together and they have an arrangement whereby they are able to assure supply of minerals for green technology, specifically for green technology. And hopefully that will at least prevent a resource war in this sector. Of course, with the defense establishment and all, you may still have conflicts, but at least you cannot, you would confine it to that and not around green technologies.
Environmental education is crucial for building public awareness and support for clean energy. How can we improve environmental education to foster a deeper understanding of the clean energy transition?
Environmental education, it's a convergent phenomenon. Grassroots efforts, you need to have better education with at the home, at the school level, but also you need the government to have some quality control over what kind of education people are getting. So and nowadays, you can't just do it through the schools. You need it through social media. You need it through all of the different ways in which we have access to learning opportunities for young people. And it should be permeating all subjects. It shouldn't be like you have to be an environmental scientist to understand environmental issues. It should be just like we used to have civic education, that at one point. If you're an engineer, you still know what it means to be a more environmentally responsible engineer, or if you're a doctor or a lawyer, whatever profession. That's very important, that environmental education should be cross-cutting across professions and not just something that only the people who are environmental scientists are pursuing.
What are the most effective ways to engage younger generations in clean energy solutions?
Nowadays, it's really social media. I mean, the media diet that now in our youth is so overwhelmingly. They get their news, they get their music, they get their entertainment from social media. So it's so overwhelmingly dominated by it that we need to, for the young generation, to focus on that, and then go from there. But ultimately, I would hope that also have a trend where people go back to some of the traditional media and still, they read books, they read other newspapers, and so on. And there are some shifts in that in terms of learning. Like Sweden, for example, has started to prohibit use of electronic media in education because they want a more traditional approach and not to have e-learning constantly and people recording videos and so on. So let's see where there is a pushback now as well, because they're finding that the literacy rates are going down. Math literacy, science literacy, the students are just not learning enough because they're relying too much on electronic content and they're not getting as much practice. So I think that is a concern. I have one of my books, Earthly Order. One of the reasons I wrote it was to make sure that our environmental community has fundamental learning around the natural science, the laws of nature, as they pursue environmental careers. So that's been my concern too, that not only does the general public not have environmental issues understood fully, but even environmental professionals don't understand the fundamental science behind sustainability.
You specialize in corporate community partnerships. How can these partnerships drive innovation and investment in clean energy?
Well, before I became an academic, I spent 2 years working at General Electric as an environmental health and safety professional. And that was a really eye opening experience for me, even though I was trained in the natural sciences and was the scientific aspects of my work. But working in a corporation made me understand what kinds of issues on a day to day basis that companies have to deal with, the kind of conflicts they have to deal with. This was a time, especially GE was going through a cleanup of the Hudson River in New York. And so there was a lot of to try and do this effectively. So that's what has inspired me to always try and see, we shouldn't be thinking of necessarily as the bad guy. It's oftentimes that they make errant decisions because of certain economic imperatives, but they are also populated by humans, who are employees, and they redeemed in terms of any mistakes they make. So a lot of my work has been around, making sure then you get corporations to come together, understand each other's constraints, and try and reconcile their differences as best possible. But if it's not possible, then there's of course the courts as well to go to.
What are the key factors for building successful and sustainable corporate community partnerships in the clean energy sector?
I think the most important part is to make sure that each side sees value in the other's contribution. There is too much on the corporations, the kind of approach to the communities, thinking that they don't understand the science, and on the community side, there's always this suspicion, a conspiratorial sense of the corporation, and so I think there needs to be a process of building that trust, that both sides see value in the other's contribution. And that can then lead to some consensus emerging over time.
How can corporations balance profitability with environmental responsibility in the context of clean energy development?
Well, it's a part of their, long-term business development strategy. They need to have a long view. They have to see that diversification is important, that they should be willing to have other new frontier technologies like clean tech as part of their business strategy. But also, they should see that even if there are some short-term costs that they're incurring for this kind of clean tech investment, in the long run, it will make them more resilient. And there's good data to show that companies who have been willing to invest in that way, like Unilever and others, have had a much better outcome down the road. And so that may be over, and it depends what time scale you're looking at, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. The oil industry, it may seem like, oh, no, that doesn't make sense for us over 10 years. But, if you look over 50 years, it makes sense for you.
How can communities ensure that they benefit equitably from clean energy projects?
Well, they have to be vigilant. They really need to make sure that every point they are consulted. And in Canada, they have these arrangements called impact benefit agreements. You want to make sure that for each of these developments, there are these clear impact benefit agreement type of outputs, which allows the community to be able to monitor and evaluate how progress is made. And they should also ask for having a seat on the table, to make sure that there are different governance mechanisms for these projects. Many times there are different planning government requirements around that. And in some cases with indigenous communities, companies have also brought indigenous leaders to serve on boards of companies so that they have a greater say. There can be different ways in which that can be arranged, but they have to be vigilant.
Your newsletter, Earthly Order, explores environmental systems science and policy. How can these systems inform our approach to clean energy?
Yeah, so the newsletter on LinkedIn, Earthly Order, which your audience may be interested in also joining, it's essentially a monthly article that I will send out as part of the newsletter to stir some debate around a particular issue that is relevant. So, for example, recently we had situation with the Ukraine and the critical raw materials deal that President Trump wanted to sign. And so I, wrote about some of the ways this agreement needed to consider basic geology, some of the ways in which we could use science more effectively to evaluate whether such an agreement would be effective or not. So I try to be news relevant in the anchor some of the around. I'm also a writer for Forbes on sustainability, and I write usually once or twice at least, usually some article around key sustainability issue, and that I also then sometimes feature in newsletter.
How can we promote a more holistic understanding of environmental systems in the context of clean energy transition?
I think the key is the operative word you used, systems oriented. Systems oriented meaning that you have multiple pathways. You have to consider social systems as well as natural systems, and you have to look for interconnections. So it's a humbling process. It's not easy. And that means you require teams. You need to have a group of people. You can't do it alone. So systems thinking inherently requires you to be able to work with others. And if you think about even under the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, which are now coming to their target date of 2030, the goal 17 is partnerships. That's one of the goals. They have goals like clean air and poverty alleviation, but they have one specific goal on partnerships, and that's precisely because of this imperative that we need to, for systems oriented approaches, you need to be able to build those relationships.
You have a new book that donates royalties to environmental literacy. Why is environmental literacy so important?
Yes, so this is the new book I have is with Oxford University Press. It's called Sustainability: A Very Short Introduction, and this is part of Oxford series on these very short introductions, and so it's very affordable. It's like about $12, and it's available online in electronic edition as well. And so I have been committed to making sure that whatever royalties I make from this, I will donate them for environmental education in Pakistan. That's my country of origin, and that those of us who are living abroad in the West and relative privilege, the least we can do is try to help our lands of origin. And so that's the goal. And the way I do that is there are several science education efforts in Pakistan. Like they have a science mela, as they call it, in Lahore. So I help to support that. There's a science society in Pakistan called Khwarizmi Science Society to support the good work they're doing, and they work on promoting science literacy, environmental education at the grassroots. And so that's something which I think, as an author, I feel is my duty. I have a full-time job, really need the extra royalty money in terms of paying my bills. So why not make a difference where it would matter more?
How can we increase environmental literacy on a global scale?
It's convergent, really. Again, you need to make sure you have. I should mention that there was an agreement on environmental education. There's in Tbilisi, Georgia, many years ago. There was this effort done to establish environmental education parameters. There has been some international movement around how we could have that. Some people have suggested we should have an environmental literacy requirement in schools and colleges. That may be something to consider also. Like we have had different other curricular requirements.
What are the most promising energy technologies or innovations that you believe will have the greatest impact in the coming decades?
I think we need to be very conscious of the way in which energy generation itself it will have to reconcile some difficult decisions. So, for example, with nuclear energy, we have a new frontier of different kinds of technologies that are going to be developed. We have thorium reactors, we have salt water, molten salt water reactors, have other kinds, modular reactors that are being developed. And so nuclear is going to see a transformation because for baseload power, and if we're really especially concerned about climate change, then we cannot really have a green transition at the same time scales that we need without some reliance on nuclear. So that's one to keep an eye on, reprocessing of nuclear fuels and making them accessible for energy generation, and some of the more safer reactor designs. Nuclear fusion, also, not just fission, but fusion, may see some traction in 20 years or so. There are some companies that are really gaining a foothold. Commonwealth Fusion Systems out of MIT, one of my alma maters, that has a lot of promise. I think you will see that there's going to be more development around fusion. And then I think there'll be also a lot more on conservation of energy. There's a lot of wastage in energy. So we can find ways of making sure that we do not waste as much energy. And this is the kind of work Amory Lovins has been doing a lot at the Rocky Mountain Institute, focusing on conservation and efficiency ways, and basically having that as the forefront. That should be our first priority. But if we are not able to meet targets through that, then we have these other sources. And I think we will have to consider nuclear. It's a very contentious issue, but I think if we really want the upscaling and the electrification of over 700 million people who still don't have access to grid electricity, we will probably need to have investment in nuclear as well.
You know, the CEO of Octopus Energy says that the best electron is the one that's produced closest to you and used as soon as it's produced.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So, the solar and batteries, the prices have come down tremendously. What do you think of the explosion of solar?
They have a lot of potential, and I'm all for solar and wind and other and electric battery usage also for providing more reliable supply. But as someone who is again a system scientist, at the material needs for solar, and I see that as being a real challenge to upscale it to the point where it could provide the same kind of baseload power that we need. So solar and wind are important, and I think for certain kinds of household uses, solar is going to become very important. But we have all these other infrastructure needs which are enormous. Look at the AI infrastructure which is being developed, huge computing power that will require electricity. We have hydropower which can play a greater role, but that has its own environmental concerns, and it's also not completely reliable. So I think in this mix, if we are to transition away from fossil fuels, we need to consider a much bigger basket of sources.
But some grid experts say the future of grids is distributed microgrids that are interconnected, kind of like the Internet of Information, where packets and electrons are connected through individual units, right? So they say that the future of grids is like that. So you don't necessarily need a baseload or a huge backbone grid.
Yeah, no, I think microgrids are important in the developing world. I would say you don't want to build national grids in places where you have very remote communities, and you want to be able to set up these kinds of systems, definitely, which are more devolved. But at the same time, I think there is some value in making sure that the existing infrastructure, since we already have grids in many parts of the world, you use that more effectively. So even though we may not want to build the same kind of massive grids that we did in the past, we don't want to waste the ones which exist. So that's where my suggestion for the grid electricity is coming from that regard. In some cases, you also want to be able to have transboundary energy projects, as we do, like with Canada having access to clean hydropower from Quebec is a very positive thing. So having that infrastructure where you can get the power from cleaner sources for high demand areas, you need some kind of grid infrastructure to do that.
High power lines interconnecting multiple countries can shift the demand time of energy between countries, right? That could
Exactly.
be very beneficial. If a lot of countries connect their grids together, that would be very beneficial for the whole system.
Exactly, yes.
What are the biggest policy changes or market shifts that could accelerate the clean energy transition on a global scale?
I think in terms of the big market shifts that we are seeing currently is the most prominent one was this household solars that people were adding, and then the impact that had on the electric utilities in many parts of the world. And so there's going to be a little bit of a disruption, but then I think there will be some calibration accordingly with those. But the other major areas will be when we are able to see much better electric car infrastructure. How will the tax mechanism function? Like in Delaware, we have been talking about as the electric car prevalence increases, you have much less revenue from gasoline tax, which is a major source of income for the state. So they have to figure out, well, do we start to tax electric cars in some way or not? So there are going to be all these really interesting decisions which have to be made at the local government level.
But a large number of electric cars, if they have V2G, then they can act as a distributed power station
Yes.
to level demand for the grid.
Yep. In fact, one of our faculty members here, Willett Kempton, he has been one of the pioneers in V2G technologies. And definitely, but it depends on how much of those car, how much use you have for the cars. They are being used for the grid, but then you also want them to be able to run, and finding that sweet spot is going to be interesting to navigate down the road. And my own feeling is ultimately we need to still focus much more on public transport infrastructure in cities. I am concerned that the electric car euphoria is going to take us away from using public transport, which is a much better, much more efficient solution than having electric cars. Again, as a system scientist, I'm focused more on that. And there are cities like Paris which reduce their car usage by 40% just by having better transport and urban design. So I wish we can do the same with the US rather than saying we have to build so much more electric car infrastructure or V2G or whatever. Those are important, but let's not miss the bigger goals of making sure we are reducing our overall consumption.
How can we overcome political and economic barriers to implement these changes?
It's really tough in this current political climate, US, and it's a lot of it really comes down to making sure we are constantly holding the media accountable. People are not being misinformed, and at some level, finding a way to enshrine these things into our legal system so that they are not easily vulnerable to political changes and tides of of politics changing. And so it's a really important question, but one which requires just a much more involved, engaged society. And unfortunately, we don't have that as much on environmental issues. So it's going to be a long haul, and that's one of the reasons why I've also come to the conclusion that ultimately we need to find a way to adapt, because we cannot change people's behavior in a liberal society where people have certain ability to act, and we value that liberty, that they want to buy something or they want to behave in a certain way. We can educate them, we can try to make them shift their behavior, or nudge them with regulations, but we can't move towards an autocratic society for other reasons. And so then the only way forward is to have some kind of suboptimal outcome whereby we find a way to then adapt to the suboptimality. And that's what we need to plan for.
There's no debate in other rich industrialized countries. The conservatives are on board with the energy transition. Yeah, there's no debate.
Yeah, it's in many parts of the world it is. I mean, but there are some where it isn't, and Germany has been a bit of an outlier with reference to they've tried to really downscale their nuclear industry, and that has led to very problematic outcomes for them in terms of reliance on Russia for fossil fuels and so on. So even though the AFD has many other problematic social issues, they have had. And in terms of energy, I think they've more pragmatic approach. But if you think about also some of the ways in which clean energy has been approached, places like India, it's kind of a difficult dynamic because you have some of the oligarchs in the energy sector who have still been dominant with the fossil fuel industry, but they are slowly transitioning towards renewable energy and investing in renewable energy. So you are right that the level of antipathy for climate change in the US currently under the Trump administration is unusual. Uh, and so let's hope that will change.
For our viewers who want to contribute to the clean energy transition, what are some practical steps they can take, whether as individuals, professionals, or policymakers?
Yeah, I think some of the practical steps they can take on an individual basis is just to change their behavior and think about how do I make decision on energy consumption, on how I behave in terms of my resource usage, what am I wasting. We have Zero Waste Day actually this week in the UN, and in fact, tomorrow I'm going to be going to UN headquarters to have a celebration of that. And there's so much which we can do at individual level in terms of just adverting to how much wastage we do have in our lives, and ultimately that wastage is linked to energy. And so the products require energy to be produced and so on. That's one of the ways in which they can work. Then certainly be engaged in the politics of the decisions that the government is making. Make sure you are more engaged if you're in a democratic society to be able to vote and participate in those decisions, and continue to be entrepreneurial, start your own efforts you can do in terms of your own business, how you are changing your business at the grassroots. So lots of things, certainly.
Yes, we highlight a lot of people who are just by doing small things can make a big difference in so many aspects of our lives.
Absolutely.
How can they stay informed and engaged in the ongoing dialogue about clean energy and sustainability?
Yes, I mean, I think the best way is to make sure that you are informed. It's through information that you are engaged. So that means you, whether it's you set up the right Google News feed in the morning, that you're getting the information. You are also making sure you are, engaged in your workplace, that you communicate to others what you learn, and you see this kind of clustering of information around these issues, and you get social change ultimately is through that incremental information transfer.
Are there any exciting developments in Southeast Asia in terms of clean energy transition?
Well, I mean, and certainly in Pakistan, there has been a huge solar uptake that has been transformational. And because we've had such a major energy crisis for years with the problem of load shedding at homes, and the solar industry and the use of batteries at home, not even in just affluent homes, but just any ordinary homes, has been transformative. It's very encouraging, the statistics we are seeing in terms of the prevalence. And in India also, there has been a major commitment now to renewable energy that is gaining traction. We have seen some developments in the use of smart hydro, small scale hydro power plants in remote areas. Those are all encouraging signs. But it's still a long way to go because of the population being so high, and overall South Asia itself is now, almost a fourth of the world's population, so very challenging.
I saw India got 500,000 two and three wheelers electrified last year, which is
Yeah,
great news.
it's amazing. Absolutely.
And they're trying to electrify rickshaws in Bangladesh, which is amazing.
Yeah, yep, totally. Also great efforts underway.
Well, Professor, this has been an incredibly insightful conversation. Your expertise in science diplomacy, environmental education, and corporate community partnerships is invaluable. Thank you for sharing your wisdom with us.
Thank you so much, sir. It's been an honor to join you. Thank you.
And to our viewers, thank you for joining us on Clean Titans. Please subscribe and follow us for more in depth discussions on the technologies and strategies driving the clean energy revolution. Until next time, stay informed and keep making a difference.